Todd in Florida wants to talk about objective morality. Pronouns are he, him.
He, him.
Todd, how you doing?
This is Todd. I am the true Todd. Yeah, objective morality. I've heard it discussed before, and some people use the argument of it's just common sense, or it just feels right, or without God-given morality, everyone would be killing each other and killing and raping and pillaging and so forth, which I find absurd because they generally say without the knowledge of the morality given by the Abrahamic God, which ignores the fact there are thousands of cultures around the world that never heard of the Abrahamic God, and somehow they have endured. How did that happen? But specifically, I find a great hypocrisy that there is this idea that consenting adults doing things with each other's genitals is somehow angering an imaginary deity, and yet standing a person on top of a stack of wood and restraining them while burning them alive, that's okay under certain circumstances. And in fact, it's commanded by the Abrahamic God in certain circumstances. How did we get there?
Well, so I guess my question is, are you concerned with like the declaration of it coming from or being an objective source, or are you just pointing out like the kind of inconsistencies of, because I'm trying to understand the at least the criticism.
I think taking an objective view of morality and saying that which does great harm to the well-being of other people is objectively a bad thing to do and therefore immoral, I think that is a good argument against the divinity of the Abrahamic God.
So I'm going to be in disagreement with you because I don't know that morality is objective. I don't actually agree with that. So I don't know that, like, I mean, couldn't it not just be the case that it's that this God just determines what is good, and whether or not we decipher that being objective or not? I don't know that, like, I mean, because you're going to have to do the work to show that, like, what you mean by well-being is actually, like, you know, the what's called the categorical imperative, which is like what we should be in accord with. Not like if I buy into some goal, right? But like objectively the case, right? Stance independent, just the idea that I'm going to have to be in accord with that or else I'm not in accord with it. So for the force of that argument to work, I mean, you're going to have to even establish objective morality, because they're not going to agree. Like, obviously, if you're interlocutor as a Christian, they're not going to agree with you, right? They're just going to think that you're begging the question against their view because they don't hold to the same metaethical view or view on morality. That would be the one concern.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because objective morality is one of the points that is often argued by theists against non-theists or anti-theists. And
yeah, I'm not convinced that they have objective morality, but I can explain that later.
I agree, and they explain it to say that objective morality would have to come from somewhere. It's a little bit like the intelligent design creationism argument that everything has to have some cause. Everything has to come from somewhere, including the things that we as humans believe to be right or wrong.
Yeah, so
things could not right or wrong because a civilization.
Are you Todd? Are you familiar with like distinctions of what? Because it's not that this is like the end all be all, but since I guess we were talking about philosophy earlier in the show, like, are you familiar with what like the philosophical distinctions on what objective and subjective are? Not that like it's the only one or something like that, but are you familiar with that distinction?
Yes.
Yeah, so objective is going to be mind, real fast, Todd. It's going to be mind independent if it's objective and it's going to be mind dependent. So if somebody says it has to come from somewhere, that doesn't really like elucidate much, because like if I'm a moral subjectivist, I think a moral proposition is true in virtue of my attitudes that I have, right? Or my desires or something like that. And so that comes from somewhere. I can predicate specifically where that comes from in the world, which is my brain or my values or my desires, or what I feel like when I do an action to somebody else and I see their response, right? But saying it comes from somewhere from them, that what they're going to say is that it's going to be independent of human minds, right? It's going to be independent of like our opinion about it. But there's a worse issue for the Christian, in my opinion, or the theist, that even in the case where like you're grounding the objectivity in like God's commands, that's going to be like funneled internally to God's properties, right? If we reduce that, it's going to be constitutive of God's properties. And so the idea is going to be that, at least the argument that I try to run on this is, what would be the contradiction in a God that has basically the exact same properties as your God, but one different moral property? And that is like in the trolley problem, it chooses to save the 5 over the 1, whereas your God chooses the 1 over the 5. Now, presumably, there's a different property in the God I'm positing, which makes that decision morally right, which shows that it's going to just be arbitrary, because whatever set of properties God has is just going to determine what's good. And then if we have verses like Romans 2:15 or something where it's like written on our hearts, then we're never actually going to know, right, if it's really the good. So it's going to be subjective. So long-winded to say, I don't think you need to make this argument against it, because theism, in my opinion, is inherently a subjective metaethical thesis, because any God with a set of properties just determines what's good. And if it was an evil God, that would determine the good, but the properties are different. That'd be like Ben saying, I think X is good, and then me saying, I think Y is good, right? We have different sets of properties, right? Different attributes, and we determine the good. That would be the same. So I don't know that you have to put as much focus on that as much as you have to say, look, what you're positing is subjectivism. It's not objectivism at all, right? I don't know if all that made sense, but
that does make sense in the realm of reason. The problem is, as Martin Luther said, that the tenets of Christian faith in the presence of reason would be absurd and false. And so to the theist, or rather to the Christian, a book says a thing, and all of their ancestors believe this thing, and they don't want to think that their ancestors were somehow buying into a flawed form of reasoning, so they double down and stand.
I see what you're saying.
In that way of thinking, and they call it objective because it is what the lawgiver says. And so a book says a thing, I believe it, that settles it. My faith trumps all else. And in doing so, they leave the realm of reason. And I would say attempting to reason from the position of Christianity is disobedient to the commandments that Christians are told to have faith, that they must have faith. And if reason could substitute for faith, you wouldn't need faith. So by attempting to reason your beliefs, you are demonstrating a lack of faith.
Well, I want to, Ben, I want to see if you get your thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm taking this call over the whole time. I don't know if you wanted to say anything before I spew again.
This isn't really my area, and I am not ashamed to admit it.
Sure. No, that's why. That's with the other call. It's like that's kind of how. I think that's why me and Ben are a great team. Is like when we do shows, we're just like, oh, you got this. This one's yours. It's great. But yeah, no. I guess one of the things that would be worth mentioning, and because the double down part, like if someone's gonna be like, you can kind of point out an inconsistency, like they really truly care about their well-being, right? And then when presented some dilemma about like their faith or religion, where they seemingly choose the God or the faith or the Holy Spirit or whatever over like this instance of suffering, right? I think you can really point out the inconsistencies when you just ask the questions, like, or you can at least show that their principle really is well-being, in the sense of that, like, or at least what we mean by well-being. I think it's a hard term to define, but I think we all kind of have the same notion when it comes to like when a Christian doesn't want to burn in hell or wants to go to heaven and be with God. I mean, what is primary there, right? It's their well-being, right? What happens when they go to hell? They burn, right? It affects them directly, right? That's why they care. That's why people care. So I think you can kind of point, at least, I don't, it's going to depend on the person, but if somebody's saying like, they choose this principle over that, I think you can point out at the very core, it's like, look, you want to be with God specifically because it affects your well-being, and you don't want to be away from God because it specifically affects your well-being. That's prior. That's completely prior. That's what you're concerned with in all cases. It just happens to be the case that you found this thing and then applied, that after the fact. But I don't know. I don't know if I was trying to make sure I was tracking your point, because I might have gotten lost in part of it.
You're correct. I just wanted to add one other thing of why this concerns me greatly. There is a minority of people in the United States, but a vocal minority, that are of the opinion that if we as a nation tolerate certain behaviors which they consider to be immoral, then God cannot bless America. And because they feel so strongly about that, they are doing things to try and manipulate positions of authority to gain more access to representation in our government to promote that idea. And I consider that dangerous, and I consider it immoral, because their beliefs are rooted in unprovable things, whereas I think it's demonstrably provable that lighting people on fire and burning them to death is a bad thing, and that's probably why we don't do it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Like in the case that you give, there's some real, like tangible interaction with, setting someone on fire, where you can really emotionally feel that. But in the other case, we don't even know if the God exists, so we don't even know if like what's being predicated is even has a referent in the world. And I would agree there 100%. Like there's the thing at which they espouse is good, right? There's a position in morality called error theory, and it's kind of like moral propositions are false because they don't have a referent in the world. And so it's kind of similar, and at least the way I'm thinking about it in my head now is just like, I mean, all the propositions technically to me are going to be false when you lay them out, like, that murder is wrong in virtue of, God's commands or something, because there's no referent of God that we can point to in the world, right? It's like saying like the king of the United States has a beard. It's like that proposition's false because there's no king of the United States. That refers to nothing in the world. It's like, I know beards exist. That's fine, right? And so in that case, yeah, I would agree. You actually have something. I maybe not say like I get weird with saying right and wrong, but you have something you can actually point to as a referent in the world that affect people, where people are victims of some action. Whereas in their case, when they espouse, it comes from something that you can't even have access to in the world or show even exists. But Todd, we appreciate your call. We're gonna move on. We got a lot of callers I want to get to, but we appreciate you calling in, Todd.